This week's podcast is sponsored by Marantz, who've been delivering advanced home audio innovations since 1953. Marantz audio products have been designed to reproduce music as it was meant to be heard, because music matters. Find out more about what makes Marantz so special at marantzmoments.com. Hello and welcome to the AVForums podcast for the 4th of November 2019, and this is not our normal podcast, it's taken a short break. So in this episode we're looking at the subject of display calibration, and to help us out with some of the answers to the subject is Tyler Pruitt from Portrait Displays. I was about to say Spectracal, we'll cover that in a second. The company behind the world famous CalMAN calibration software. Welcome, Tyler.
Thanks for having me.
And also here is Steve Withers. Steve's a grumpy old man. Hello, Steve.
Hello, everybody.
So good to have you both here. Like I say, this is pre-recorded because the podcast is on holiday, but we're going to cover the subject calibration. I know our listeners are interested in this. We're going to see how long we go this evening discussing the subject, but obviously having Tyler here is important. CalMAN is the industry standard when it comes to calibration software, and I know Tyler has a long career in this subject. So to kick things off, Tyler, why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself and tell our listeners what you do?
Yes, so my role currently is as technical evangelist, so I'm responsible for public speaking and training, and but I still work with the engineering team very closely on workflows and actually methodologies for calibration using our software. I actually was a CalMAN user before I started working for the company. I actually did calibrations as a side gig when I was working in the aerospace industry, and then I got brought on to work on the software and provide tech support at first. So it's kind of just snowballed from there. I've been here over 5 years, and a lot of things have changed in those 5 years with regards to HDR, wide color gamut, and high resolution displays.
Now, you have been on the podcast before. Some of our regular listeners will have heard yourself on the podcast in the past, where we did cover HDR when it was brand new and people were scratching their heads. And I understand we're at the point now where people are still scratching their heads a little bit, and we're still trying to understand the technology.
Yeah, well, I think things are a lot more clear. I mean, when the displays were first released, even I think some of the display manufacturers were having challenging times on how things should actually go, because a lot of the standards when they were first released described how you would describe the content metadata, but they never told the display manufacturers what you're supposed to do with that. So it was kind of up to them to figure it all out. But I think we're in a place where most of them have figured it out. They do have their own technologies as far as, especially with the HDR10, there is no standard for how you're supposed to do tone mapping. So each one of them has their own kind of strategy for that. But it is kind of a good thing, because I see it as having competition between the manufacturers, and they can kind of push the industry forward. And maybe in another few years we'll have, this is the absolute best way to do the tone mapping. But until then, it's kind of competition is driving better and better picture quality every single year.
It's interesting you say that. We'll come on to calibration in a second, but you've raised an interesting point there. Is it the case that HDR10 going forward will still be a thing with static metadata? Are we not going to see a transition to dynamic metadata for everything?
So it's really easy right now to, if you're doing an HDR10 release, to do the HDR10 Plus. So I foresee a lot of people, if they're going to do HDR10, they'll have the HDR10 Plus there. They might also be doing Dolby Vision. There's nothing that says you can't have HDR10 Plus, HDR10, and Dolby Vision on one UHD Blu-ray disc. So I think that's probably the end game. And then we'll still have the HLG implementations for a lot of the live broadcasting.
Yeah. So this is a subject we'll come back to later in the conversation. So calibration. Myself and Steve know the answers to a lot of the questions that we're going to be asking tonight. But obviously, as we've got you here, Tyler, it's a good opportunity to get your input and your own opinions on the subject matter. So can you give us a thoughts on what you see as calibration for consumer TVs and projectors? What is calibration?
Well, when the content is being created, whether it be TV shows, even live broadcasts or movies, it's critically important that all of the monitors that are being used to work on the film or TV project are calibrated to the same color standard. So when it goes through this long pipeline of on-set, VFX, things like that, everybody's on the same page as far as colors. Because if I hand my content to you and then Spider-Man becomes a different color, that's a huge problem. Now, what calibration means for consumers is you want to have your display look as close to the mastering display that was used to actually master the content, so you can experience the creative intent that those filmmakers wanted you to see with their movie. And color can really change what a scene actually makes you feel. If something's really bluish, it can make you feel kind of, hesitant and stuff. If it's a really warm overall color temperature, then it can really feel engaging and warm and like loving. And if your TV is actually doing that instead of what was in the actual content, then you can totally have a different experience with the content than what the creative intended you to have. So that's what calibration brings, not only to the mastering and actually content creation side, but to the actual experience that you or me will have in our own home theaters.
Now, let's crack through some myths before we get right into the subject. So there's a few myths going around. One of the things that really annoys me about the word calibration is the way that the word is being misused by journalists. There's some YouTubers out there, enthusiasts, and they use the word calibration to describe what we would call setting up their display. So looking at the display by eye, adjusting some of the settings until they think it looks good. But in my opinion, that is not calibration.
Yeah, and some people don't like a calibrated image. Some people want to see oversaturated colors. This was a big thing when phones started going to OLED. Some of the manufacturers just let them go to their native color gamut, which was way oversaturated. Some people like that. So I don't think, I don't advocate that calibration is right for everybody, but you should know what calibration is and what it isn't. And just tweaking stuff by eye is not calibration. Even if you are a color scientist or a calibrator that has been doing this for 10 years, there's stuff called chromatic adaptation that happens in our visual system, and your brain is very easily tricked by environmental factors of what's around the TV or what you've been looking at. If you've been looking at your laptop for a while, and then all of a sudden you look up at the screen and there are two different white points, your brain can be tricked. So it's just important to know what calibration is and what it isn't, but it's not for everybody. But for people that want to see the content exactly how the creator intended, calibration is what is necessary.
Tyler, you mentioned there about doing things by eye. Now, I've heard stories about calibrators turning up and saying they can calibrate by eye. I take it you can say categorically that anyone who says that is lying.
Well, I mean, maybe there's one person out of 7 billion that can do that, but I don't think it's common.
So when someone does turn up at a customer's front door, if they hire a professional calibrator, what kind of things would you expect that calibrator to be bringing with them to do the calibration?
Software, a measurement device, whether it be a colorimeter or a spectradiometer, and a way to generate reference patterns. We have worked with manufacturers to add pattern generators into the displays. But in my opinion, that was really a goal to help consumers that maybe can't afford a $1,500 or more pattern generator. I would expect a professional calibrator to still use an external generator just so there's nothing that could happen. And then they can also validate. One important thing is validation signal chain, especially with a lot of people going with all their source devices through AV receivers these days. It's possible that you can misadjust an AV receiver. Now, if you are a consumer and you are using the internal generator on, say, the 2019 LG TVs or the 2019 Panasonics, one thing you can do is use a manual pattern disk to just check a few colors through the whole signal chain just to validate that your receiver isn't doing anything. But usually if something's happening wrong, all the colors will be messed up. So you don't really need to do everything if you're a consumer and you're actually just using the internal generator. Just spot checking some colors should reveal any problems through your whole signal chain at the end if you use a pattern disk to just check a few colors.
You also mentioned creator's intent, Tyler, and to me it seems to be it's great in one aspect and maybe not so good in another. I think in terms of marketing from the likes of Panasonic and Sony recently about how they're going for accuracy and how the director intended, and Hollywood to the home, and from lens to your home, and different marketing slogans like that. It's great because it educates the public, and they are turning out product that does get fairly close out of the box to what we would call the industry standards. But I guess as well, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but the overuse of maybe director intended, see it as the director intended. Do you think that could maybe put people off because they think, well, who are you to tell me how my TV should look or how my picture should look? Do you think there's a possibility that it will have that effect on some people?
I don't think so, because at the end of the day, at least, creative content like TV and movie, it's art, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't go to an art gallery and want to wear like colored glasses to experience somebody else's art. It's really, these creatives they go shot by shot. They spend a lot of time on each scene on how they want it to look and how they want it for you to experience it. And I think that is, I'm in favor of artists, and I want to see how they wanted me to see it. Now, when it comes to video games or something, a lot of people think, oh, video games, they don't have they don't care about the same things. When actually there's a myth that, a game mode should be like oversaturated and really blue and stuff. When actually a lot of the game studios that I've worked with, they care about their color accuracy just as much as the movie people. And in fact, a lot of the people that are making AAA titles in HDR, Xbox, and PlayStation games, and PC games for that matter, a lot of them will have a $30,000 Sony BVM or other reference monitor to do final checks on their HDR, or just to see exactly what it's going to look like on a perfect monitor. So then when they can look at on their HDR TVs, they want to see how far it's off from what they were actually going for. So everything from films and TVs to video games, the creators really care about the presentation. They are nitpicky over every single detail in what they created, and I think that's important to preserve.
Now, I guess another misconception that people do have, and maybe we can look at it a little bit here, is that, like you said, creatives, they look at a scene, they look at how they're going to light that scene, whether they're going to have a really gritty look to their movie, or if they're going to have a really warm look to their movie. This might confuse people as to, well, if you're calibrating the TV, how can it possibly be all those different things in one? So I guess what we need to look at here is what we say by the standards is actually at best probably described as a container in which, if everything's set up correctly within that container, then the creative can do anything they like within that, and that you are seeing that the way they intended it to be seen. Would that be a fair way of looking at that subject?
Yeah, so for example, our most common white point is D65. That doesn't mean in the movie white has to be that color. It just means the monitor, when it receives equal values of red, green, and blue, it should produce that color. But then after you have that baseline of accuracy, then the creative part takes over, and they can make the white point in the scene whatever they want. They could make it crazy blue, or for example, in the Matrix, when they're in the Matrix, everything's green. Now, if your monitor is too blue, then it will make that green too blue. Or if your monitor is too red, then that green will have extra red added to it. So the important thing is when we calibrate a monitor or a TV, we are making it a neutral canvas that was the same neutral canvas that the creatives used when they made the film. So whatever they decided to do is properly conveyed into your living room.
And that's the whole point of calibration, isn't it? It's to set the display up and then know that anything that you send to the display, as long as it was mastered properly, you're going to see it how it was intended to be seen.
Absolutely.
Or are you? How close are consumer TVs to the professional displays that are used in grading suites and mastering facilities and so on. I mean, I've had a BVM X300 here recently, and I've been doing a lot of comparisons with OLED. So I'll let you know what I think after I get your opinion, because it has surprised me a little bit.
Well, for SDR, we have to talk about SDR and HDR different.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So today's top-of-the-line consumer TVs can be calibrated to be just as accurate as an SDR reference monitor. In fact, they are actually being used as SDR reference monitors. There are TV shows in the US, and I'm sure in the UK, just because I've talked to facilities there too, that are actually using these TVs as mastering displays for SDR. Now, that being said, the reason that works is because the capabilities of the TV is actually larger. The brightness, the color gamut is actually larger than what SDR BT709 is. So we just have to rein in the TV's performance to that standard, and then we have that. We could produce all of those colors without any issue. Now with HDR, the mastering displays are still, even if the TV is brighter than, for example, the BBM X300, really there's certain colors, and we've had them side by side in a lot of facilities and even at events. There's still certain colors that are just not possible on the TV yet.
Yeah.
Or maybe they can be, but the accuracy of calibration just isn't there yet on the consumer displays. Certain technologies have certain advantages, and then we have other technologies that have different advantages, and if we could like combine them, then we'd have the perfect display. But I think we're still not quite getting everything in HDR. I would say 95% of the scenes you'll look at look the same, but there will be some colors that just aren't displayed on the consumer TVs.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I found. SDR, very, very difficult to tell them apart, to be honest. But then you do start to really notice differences, especially with OLED when it comes to colours and certain colours, certain hues, where there are quite some differences there, which I found surprising because, like you say, for maybe 3/4 of the scene you're watching, they look identical, and then suddenly there's a colour, say blue of the ocean, and there's such a huge difference between how those look. It surprised me quite a bit, actually, because it's the first time I've had the opportunity to do that and to have them side by side in circumstances where I have control over everything that I'm doing with the displays. So yeah, I found it really, really interesting. And I guess another thing I found, I don't know if your experiences will be the same, Tyler, but even with the BVM X300, it's a RGB OLED. It was able to do 1,000 nits easily. Obviously it's got 3 huge fans on the back to cool the panel down and so on, and it's a professional unit, but seeing 1,000 nits done properly on a professional monitor, it just shows you where there is still potential to make our consumer displays a lot better. Yeah,
and one thing that people should know is the X300 is no longer being made. Sony is not making those panels anymore. Yeah. And as an industry, Hollywood is moving to LCD-based HDR technology right now. It's not saying that OLED doesn't have a future. There's other manufacturers that are going to try to go into that space. But the new technology that is being used is what's called a light modulating cell layer. And it's essentially 2 LCDs stacked on top of each other. One acts as like a monochrome backlight control for the front LCD. And I would say that it's 98 to 99% as good as an X300. The only one issue that it has is some viewing angle issues. Because of the 2 layers, you can get ghosting. Yeah. But when we're talking about a 30-inch monitor, most of the artists are looking directly at it. You wouldn't sit on a couch with a group of people to watch a 30-inch monitor.
Yeah, it's like a near field monitor, isn't it? Really, you're going to be sat right in front of it if you're working on anything. So,
but it does have the pixel level control like OLED, and there's 0 blooming. Honestly, on most scenes, having them side by side, you'll see 0 difference. So that's kind of like the new technology, and it's also being put out by a lot of different manufacturers because the panels are widely available to different different reference monitor manufacturers. So we are actually seeing some competition for features and functions in that market now, which I think is good.
And of course, if it's happening in that market, it doesn't take too long to come down the chain, does it, to the consumer displays? And if we're all pushing for, as the directors intended, you'd hope that the manufacturers of these consumer displays are listening.
Absolutely. And I think I think we're at a point where we're going to start seeing what I would consider like a big, like we've had different generations of HDR TVs starting with in 2015. But I think we're in a second wave of LCD technology with the dual layer and also mini LED backlighting. So I'm very excited for that. And also we're going to start seeing higher resolution OLEDs. LG Display showed a 65-inch 8K panel at CES in the LG Display booth. So it wasn't a actual consumer product, but hopefully we'll be able to see the 8K OLEDs in smaller sizes than the 88-inch, because I don't know about anybody else, but I don't even know if that would fit up my stairs.
Plus it's 30,000.
I actually
30 grand.
I had to help put one back in a box at a trade show yesterday, so that was interesting.
The stand alone weighs a ton, never mind the TV.
And you have to have the stand as well, don't you? It's part of the sound system, isn't it? Yeah. Right. So getting back to calibration, then obviously myself and Steve went through training many moons ago, and we've been reviewing TVs and measuring TVs for 16 odd years myself, and I think you're very, very close to that as well, Steve, in terms of how long we've been doing this.
Over a decade.
And we've seen the technology move on. We, like yourself, Tyler, we've spoken to manufacturers, we've consulted with them and pushed them. And I guess we're at a stage now where, 10 years ago, we had to go into service menus. You needed service codes to get into the menus to make changes, and that was just to do the grayscale. You didn't get CMS. There's only certain TVs that allowed you to do that. Now you look at any TV on the market, and they more than likely will have ISF modes or calibration modes in there, where you can lock the settings, where you can put codes in and expand so you get more picture presets and so on. It's a huge jump from where we were just, like I say, 10, 15 years ago. And now we're getting to the stage where the TV will do a lot of the work for you. Like you say, you mentioned pattern generators built into Panasonic and LG TVs. And of course, CalMAN now does AutoCal, which for professional calibrators, for reviewers like myself, it saves a hell of a lot of time. But as a consumer as well, it's a great feature there, which I guess as a company you've been trying to get the cost of entry down so consumers can use this facility. Yeah,
so earlier this year with the first release of CalMAN 2019, we released a new series of products called CalMAN Home, and they're manufacturer specific. So if you have an LG TV, you buy the CalMAN Home for LG. If you have the Samsung one, you buy CalMAN Home for Samsung. And it's actually a much lower price point than our previous home version, which started at $399 US. And now these new versions are $149 US. They are a little bit limited on hardware support. For example, they don't support things like the K10 or things like that. $7,000 meter or equivalent, but it's very exciting that we can have users get that kind of results. And it's not for everybody. There is a learning curve still. So I don't think it's ever going to replace professional calibrators. That wasn't the goal at all. But if somebody's an enthusiast and they actually want to learn about color science and display technology and how calibration works, it's a great way to get involved and to calibrate your TV. And you can even though it only supports AutoCal for one manufacturer, it also supports manual calibration for any display. So you could buy it and have fun and calibrate your brother's TV or your parents' when you go back there for the holidays, so you don't have to look at an uncalibrated display.
I guess one of the things is education, Tyler, and how are you managing that? Because I have seen on our forums end users buy a meter and use it with their TV with the AutoCal, and they're worrying about differences in delta E differences of 0.2 to 0.4, which they're just not going to see. It's not an issue whatsoever. Yeah. So how do you get that education across?
Well, we've been trying to do more. We've really upped our game as far as our user guides on our new knowledge base that's on portrait.com. And let me mention, we've decided to retire the SpectraCal brand, and everything is under the Portrait brand now. It's a pretty easy website to remember, portrait.com. But we're also doing a lot more tutorial videos. I myself am actually doing those. So on our YouTube page, we have tutorial videos for the home products. I'm just getting ready to finish the Samsung ones now. The Sony, LG, and Panasonic ones are already up on our YouTube page. But we're also focusing on our professional products. And if you've upgraded to our new CalMAN 2019 R2, which is release 2, we typically do 2 to 3 major releases per year, kind of like how Xbox does a spring or fall release for the OS. And with R2, we've pretty much almost replaced every single professional workflow. So we've tried to simplify it and kind of combine things. We've also had categorical separations of workflows, so it's not one huge list anymore. So at the same time, we're working to make the consumer be able to do their own TVs if they do so wish. We're also really focused on our professional users and making things easier for them. And we got a lot more things coming in CalMAN R3 and the first version of CalMAN 2020.
Tyler,
Yes.
when someone gets their TV or projector calibrated, Phil mentioned about delta E's of 0.4 or something like that. But what kind of level of accuracy could they really expect a calibrator to get from a consumer product these days?
It all depends on how precise the controls on the TVs are. I would expect, especially for SDR, everything should be under delta E 2000 of 3, if not lower. On some TVs, they can get even lower, but it all depends on how precise the controls we are given with the manufacturer. Also, I just did the talk at the SMPTE Technical Conference in Los Angeles. That's why I was down there, and this week. And it's actually on a new Delta E formula called Delta E ITP. Delta E 2000 was never really designed for displays. It's based on an underlying perceptual color space called CIE LAB, and that was really designed for reflective measurements. So a light source reflecting off of an object and then measuring that, not an actual display emitting colors. Because the main issue with the CIE lab formula is it assumes your human visual system is adapted to a white color. Well, if you're watching a dark show and there is no white on screen, and maybe say Game of Thrones episode 3 this season, where the whole scene is dark for the whole episode practically, your eye is not adapted to 100 nit white. So Delta E 2000 has been known to underreport errors near black. So we actually did a paper comparing this new Delta E formula, Delta E ITP, which is based on the ICTCP color space, which actually uses the PQ curve as a absolute curve for luminance, and it doesn't assume you're adapted to any white. It assumes you're adapted to the color under measurement, and it actually has quite big differences from DE 2000. So I think over the coming year or two, you're going to start seeing people use Delta E 2000 and Delta ITP to show results at the same time, just so you can start to see how those correlate to each other and not to be scared about larger numbers in Delta ITP. And I think we're going to kind of have to unlearn this, expect to be under 1 or under 2, because the ITU is actually saying in their document for Delta ITP, the ITU document is actually BT 2124. I know the standards bodies love these numbers, right? But they've actually defined it to say it should be under 3 with a Delta ITP. Now, for SDR, that's pretty achievable right now. But in our paper, we actually measured an HDR reference monitor, and some of the HDR colors were over a Delta E of 10 in ITP. Now, Delta E 2000, they were all under 3. So just knowing that you might see these larger errors with this larger delta E with this newer delta E formula. I think it's important not to freak out, just to be able to find, here's what delta E 2000 would say, here's what this new metric will say, and just kind of learn that new relationship between those. But I think it's important because a lot of display manufacturers have started to use delta E in marketing, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because a lot of them are probably going to still want to use delta E 2000. And in my opinion, and what we found in our paper, is delta E 2000 is most useful between 15 and 100 nits, and not much more saturated than 709. Once you start pushing out to P3 and larger, more saturated colors, that's when we see a major deviation in the two formulas.
It's getting this information across as well that's understandable to the end user, because for us three sitting here, we're used to talking about these things, we understand them and so on, but we've got to remember that when we review items and we're putting our reviews out there, not everybody understands the concept. But if you're able to say, and it's a phrase I use a lot in my reviews, is that if it's under the visible threshold of 3, then you shouldn't see that error on screen. And I found that is the easiest way to describe delta E 2000. Now, moving to this new delta E where you have larger errors, are you able to say where the visible threshold is within those?
So the way it's been engineered is a delta E of 1 should be 1 J and D, which is a just noticeable difference, but that's on two colors right next to each other. So really, you could probably get away with more J and D error when we're not talking about two colors right next to each other in a 2-degree field of view or something like that. With actual content, we're seeing that you can have much more error before there's an actual visible difference, just because it's not just a uniform flat color.
Yeah.
If things have texture, it's been known to affect our perception of color differences. So I think there's actually needs to be more research done, and we might actually do some of that ourselves. There is it seems like in the blue region, like saturated blues, the delta E ITP metric is very sensitive to error, and we want to make sure that, or we're interested to find out if that correlates to actual human experiments. So I still think there's a little bit of work to be done, but I think for the time being, if you're going to use delta ITP, you should show the delta E 2000 at the same time, just so people can have a frame of reference.
Yeah. Tyler, when you mentioned HDR, now when it comes to calibrating SDR, there's long established approaches and methodology, and as you said, the TVs themselves, the displays themselves now have capabilities far beyond SDR. So calibrating SDR tends to be a case of just bringing in the native capabilities of the TV to hit the targets for that particular standard. When we move on to HDR, it's still, the Wild West out there sometimes, with so many, with tone mapping being applied and the actual content being mastered at levels well beyond the capabilities of most displays, if not all of them. How do you go about calibrating HDR?
Well, so I actually did a paper on my feelings and kind of industry feelings back in 2017 about how unless a manufacturer can give us what their actual intended tone mapping shapes should be, then if we're kind of fighting against what they're trying to do, and they've spent millions of dollars in R&D in Korea or Japan or Europe on picture quality and what they think tone mapping should be, we don't want to really undo that with calibration. Now, if we're calibrating a mastering display, we want it to just follow the PQ curve and then hard clip, but that's so a colorist can see the content clip and then bring it back. But on a TV, there has to be a roll-off. Now, where that roll-off starts and the shape of it is not defined by anybody. So, for example, with LG this year, we can actually change the tone curve shape, the consumer can, because even though LG has came up with theirs, they thought it would be interesting to have other people be able to change the tone curve shape and almost like give the power to the people. And maybe with thousands of people doing this, somebody figures out the perfect roll-off for 1,000 nit content or the perfect roll-off for 4,000 nit content. With regards to Dolby Vision, they have an interesting approach where instead of calibrating the TV to a color gamut or something like that, the process is to turn off Dolby Vision processing. Then we calibrate the TV to 2.2 gamma, because all these panels, even though they're HDR, they're still 2.2 gamma panels. And then we put a PQ curve on top of them. So the Dolby's methodology is to bypass the Dolby Vision processing, which puts the TV into native panel behavior. We calibrate the TV to D65 2.2 gamma. Then we actually measure what the primaries are and the peak brightness and feed that information back into the TV. And then Dolby's tone mapping knows exactly what the TV's capabilities are. Now, I have proposed that should happen for HDR10 as well. No manufacturer has implemented it, but at the end of the day, I think until we have displays that equal perfectly to the mastering displays, we're going to have some type of tone mapping or gamut mapping. But we really don't want to negate what the TV is trying to do and fight against it. So I still think we're at a place where there is improvements that can be made in the future, and we're working with manufacturers to constantly improve on accuracy and what they intended, what their picture quality teams think was the best way to do something.
Okay, so Tyler, so far we've been talking about HDR delivery through streaming systems, disc-based formats, and so on, which are obviously they're all pre-recorded, they've all been mastered, and so on, and all you're doing is watching that back. Now, you mentioned HLG earlier on, which is obviously a broadcast standard, and we're starting to see in the UK the BBC using that mostly on their natural history programming, but also on some sports. And myself and Steve, we saw a demonstration, probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, of a rugby game. And I think it was in Dolby Vision at the time, and it was amazing because half of the stadium was in shadow, half of it was in sunlight, yet you didn't get the problem of the iris having to be manually opened and closed whenever the ball went into the dark area or into the light area. It was great just watching the whole experience, and it was like, I know it's a cliche, but it was like being in the stadium and watching the game. So what do you think about live HDR implementations, Tyler, and where do you see things going?
I think it's one of the most exciting things happening right now with HDR, along with gaming. It seems like the game developers and the broadcasters aren't afraid to really make things look exciting. Where filmmakers, they're kind of constrained because they also have to deliver SDR versions that will be in the theater and stuff like that. So they don't want to deviate too far from their original intent for the movie theater at 48 nits. But HDR Sports, we've started to get some stuff from Fox Sports and DirecTV in the U.S. Fox Sports has started streaming Thursday night NFL football and baseball, the World Series, and it's really exciting because it just looks like you're at the game, and the realism is just hard to describe. Sometimes it looks more real than if you were actually there. So usually what happens is it's really hard to do PQ in a camera because then you're kind of turning a camera into kind of a measurement device instead of a camera. You're trying to say, hey, this code value equals this brightness. So then the camera has to have this inverse curve to try to equal brightness to code values. So that's why a lot of the workflows are using HLG in the camera, which instead of being an absolute standard is a relative standard. So it's kind of like SDR. It's really like SDR with a log curve at the top of the SDR gamma curve to preserve those highlights. And it allows backwards compatibility where instead of like when they did 3D, they would have to have 2 broadcast trucks and 2 different productions, and it would cost twice as much. But now with HLG productions, they can extract the SDR version from the HDR version and only have one broadcast truck. So it's backwards compatible. They don't have to do 2 things. So I think that's going to accelerate the deployment into live things like the Olympics and English Premier League and events like that, because it doesn't really cost anymore. And the top productions are always upgrading to the latest 4K or even 8K cameras, and they have support for this already. So it's all about getting the infrastructure in place to do the real-time conversion to SDR and be able to deliver the HLG version either over the top or through actual broadcast and satellite platforms. But I think HDR just brings live sports to a whole nother level. And once people see it, it's going to be like when Blu-ray or HDR came out. You don't want to watch the previous generation technology after you've seen the future.
Yeah, no, seeing that demo stuck in my mind, just how good it was. What frame rate are they using for the NFL Thursday games?
60 frames per second.
60 frames. So it should look...
And I believe they're actually they're doing 1080p HDR because of infrastructure constraints, where a lot of these broadcasters have just, they just spent hundreds of millions of dollars with SDI switching, and a big limitation is the instant replay systems. To instant replay 4K 60, it's actually a lot of storage, and the existing instant replay systems are not equipped to do 4K. So they're actually doing a down convert to 1080p, but the HDR is the important thing. And most, for example, Fox has always been 720p 60. So the 1080p is actually a detail increase, plus we get the HDR on top of it.
Tyler, every calibrator I know uses CalMAN. I mean, there have been other calibration softwares available, but I think everyone I know, and certainly Phil and I both use it, CalMAN is the de facto software that's used for professional calibrations. Why do you think that is? What does CalMAN do that others don't, and why is it the choice of the professional?
I think it's a combination of compatibility. We support the most displays and the most equipment. We sell our own pattern generators and meters, but we also support most other ones that are made from companies like Klein, Konica Minolta, Photo Research, Colorimetry Research, X-Rite. Most likely, if you have a measurement device that was made in the last 10 years, CalMAN supports it. We also support the most pattern generators out of anybody, Quantum Data, Meridio, our own, even software devices like our software tools in Hollywood like DaVinci Resolve. And then there is the customizability. We allow our professional users to customize or create their own workflows and design. We have something called design mode, and that enables them to make CalMAN however they want. It's like almost giving the users the power to design the user interface of the software. They can make big buttons, they can make small buttons, they can have a ton of charts on a screen, they can have a screen with just one chart. So it's super flexible. I kind of consider CalMAN a Swiss Army knife. Like most people use the knife and stuff, but there's those weird ones in there that nobody ever uses, but it's there just in case. So that's why I think it's really popular, and it's a lot easier to use than alternative tools.
Yeah, I've got to say, I've found myself sitting there for an hour or two going through all the different workflows just to see how things are laid out and how things work, and then try and look at certain areas, and it's so flexible, and you can change all the parameters that you need to change if you think you need to change them. And so I find it excellent, and I know that I'm only scratching the surface of what it can do as well. When it comes to, because I'm not a professional calibrator, I don't go out to customers' homes or anything like that. I just use it for review purposes and for my own, testing and assessment of products and so on. So I know that I'm just scratching the surface of it.
What I also like about it is that, and you mentioned this right at the very beginning of this podcast, but things are changing so fast in terms of display technology over the last year, but certainly over the last 5 years. Things have changed fundamentally, really, with the introduction of HDR. But the good thing about CalMAN is that it evolves with that, so that it's always staying up to date and addressing any developments or changes in display technology and any new additions or new features. So certainly from my perspective, it's an invaluable tool. Yeah,
and we like to be pretty much on the cutting edge of new things like Delta E formulas or new standards like BT 2020 and the HDR curves, because a lot of the times a standard will get standardized, and then, hey, display manufacturers need to validate their displays against the standard, and if it's not in CalMAN when they're doing their R&D, then they have nothing to measure against, and then they might have to revert back to using an Excel spreadsheet and manual enter of data, and that was the origination of CalMAN. Over 10 years ago, as it started out as the most complicated Excel spreadsheet of all time, and if we added one more row, it would crash, and it actually talked to hardware. So a lot of things have changed in the last 10 years with regards to calibration. Actually, it's more like closer to 15, but yeah, we try to be very responsive to the industry and what the industry needs, and that includes consumers and professional calibrators.
And I've got to say, and again, it's not just because you're on here and we're trying to butter you up in any kind of way, but you have listened to feedback, and I can vouch for that. I've asked for things in the past that would make my job easier, and they've been implemented, and I've got that feature that I wanted. So yeah, when it comes to flexibility, absolutely spot on, and it's intuitive to use as well, which is why I find AutoCal really quite fascinating. Like you say, it's never going to replace a calibrator, and even if somebody turned up at your door, you hired them with the software and meters and pattern generators and all the rest of it. A lot of it is experience as well. When you're hiring a calibrator, you're hiring them for their experience as well. That they've played with all the latest TVs and displays. They know their way around. They know how to solve problems. They're used to how things work and so on. But AutoCal I find fascinating in terms of the consumer can go out and buy a relatively cheap meter, and $150 is not a hell of a lot of money if they're an enthusiast, and then actually sit and learn on their own, and to know that they've got that backup there as well. I find that a really interesting way, and I'll be interested to see how that catches on.
And one thing is, we've seen a lot of people in like really remote areas that don't have access to a calibrator, or they don't know anybody else that wants to have their TV calibrated. So even calibrators that do travel, it would be prohibitively expensive for somebody to fly into like, I don't know if there's any calibrators in Iceland, but there probably is, but we've sold copies of CalMAN there. The home version. So I think that's also a powerful thing, is like some people don't have any calibrators around them, especially in certain countries. There's not wide acceptance that calibration is a thing, or maybe it's just an education thing. They haven't been exposed to the messaging behind calibration and creative intent preservation. So like I said, we're not trying to replace the professional calibrators. One thing I do say is, half of learning calibration is learning CalMAN. The other half is learning the different TV manufacturers. And if most calibrators spend time figuring it all out before they start going to clients' houses. They don't want to figure it out at the client's house. So that's kind of what you're paying for also, is the experience.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent long evenings. Steve's probably the same. You're probably the same, Tyler, where you think, right, I've got 20 minutes. I can go and calibrate this set and get ready for later. And 4 or 5 hours later, you're still sitting trying to troubleshoot something that you weren't expecting to happen, and suddenly it's happened, and you need to find a way around it. But having the right tools, that's what helps, and that's the way you build your experience as well, isn't it? Just to wrap up. You said AutoCal is not there to replace professional calibrators. So what was the motivation behind AutoCal? Was it to make a professional calibrator's job easier, or was it to go down the route of giving consumers more of a way in?
The first was to eliminate this really repetitive going into the menu over and over and over, especially with displays that have 20-point grayscale. Going back and forth, and a lot of displays you can't have the menu on screen because it will affect the reading. And we're talking back to the plasma days. If you had a white menu bar up on screen, it would affect your patch reading on a plasma. So just the experience of going into the menu over and over and over, coming back out, that doesn't help anybody, right? There's not really skill in that. Knowing what you want, knowing what you're trying to do is what the calibrator wants to do. So the idea was to automate some of the repetitiveness out of calibration. It wasn't intended to be a one click and you're done type of thing. It was Here, we'll walk you through it, and we'll automate the stuff that's super repetitive, just so you can get consistent results, and also so a consumer can get nearly the same results as a professional calibrator. Obviously, if the calibrator has much higher end equipment, then that's a factor that needs to be taken into account for as well.
Well, that was my next question. Are you looking at meters these days and low-cost meters? Just how accurate can they be compared to, say, something like a Klein K10 or something along those lines?
It all depends. Like, for example, the RC6, we hand check every one in our color lab, where some of the off-the-shelf meters, lower cost ones that you can buy on Amazon, for example, I don't know what their QC process is for actually checking every one with a Photo Research or a Minolta. We check every one, but also, things are getting cheaper. You can buy used i1 Pros on eBay to create your own meter profiles. We support meter profiling even on the home version. So if somebody has an i1 Display Pro and an i1 Pro, they can create their own meter profiles. And another thing that some calibrators offer as a service is you can hire them to just bring their high-end spectroradiometer, their Jetty or their Photo Research or their colorimetry research or Minolta to your house, create a meter profile with your meter, and then from now on, your meter is just as accurate as that spectroradiometer. So a lot of professional calibrators actually offer that as a service. So if you want absolute accuracy, you could look into that if you still want to do it yourself without spending as much as like a used 3 Series BMW on a piece of measurement equipment.
Well, it's been a great start to our conversation on calibration. We hope to have you back on the podcast at some point in the near future. I'm sure we'll bump into each other at CES as well, which is not too far away, frighteningly not too far away. But it's been great having you on the podcast. Just one thing, on about sports there. Are you a Seahawks fan?
Absolutely.
5-2 this season. Are you going to hit the playoffs?
I don't want to jinx anything.
They're not having a London game this year, are they?
Nope, we had one last year.
It was last year. Yeah. Did you come over for it?
No, but I plan to do that in the future the next time they're playing.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, great. Tyler, thank you very much for your time this evening on the podcast. It has been a pleasure. If anybody's got any questions on what we've discussed this evening on the podcast, then please add them to the comments section under the podcast on AVForums or under the video in the video description on YouTube, and we'll be sure to feed them back. And if Tyler has time to answer any of them, or if we can answer them on his behalf, then we will do that. And like I say, we're going to have a whole series talking about calibration. Our next one is going to be with some professional calibrators, just to find out what it is they do when they come to your home. So if you're thinking about hiring a professional calibrator to come and calibrate your TV, we're going to be discussing everything, not just picture quality, but the whole video chain and what you should be expecting from a calibrator when they come to your home. So that's it for the podcast this week. My thanks to Tyler. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you.
And thanks to Steve.
You're welcome, Phil.
And don't forget to tune in next week for the normal podcast. But until then, we'll see you again next week.